George Herbert Walker was a St. Louis financier who went to New York and became the president of W.A. Harriman Company, which later became Brown Brothers Harriman. And George Herbert Walker's daughter married a man named Prescott Bush, who entered the firm of Brown Brothers Harriman. And they had a son whom they named after her father, George Herbert Walker Bush, the present President of the United States. So here again, much of my research has been into family dynasties. Now, many of our presidents have been outsiders, like Ronald Reagan. He was a Hollywood figure. He was not a dynastic figure. He had no interest or any stake in the international financial scene. So what they did was they simply threw him a few crumbs now and then. When he was ready to leave the White House, they bought him a nice home in California, sort of a pension plan, and so he was taken care of. But he was never in any way a family member of the international world order. Now, these so-called anti-communist right-wing organizations, which you may have heard of in recent years, such as American Enterprise Institute, Heritage Foundation, the Georgetown Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. These are all run by a very small group of people. Gene Kirkpatrick is a member of most of them. And they also can be traced directly back to the Trotskyite organization, the League for Industrial Democracy. This is all a matter of record. And they pretty much direct the CIA and its worldwide operations today. Now, I spoke in Florida, and I spoke at some length about the Heritage Foundation and the numerous links which its directors had with the world order. She said, you know, I just sent them a check for $1,000. I certainly wish I hadn't sent it. But she said, I'm not going to send them anymore. And if any of you are supporting any of these fake right-wing organizations, I urge you to look around, find out what your money is being spent for, find out what their program is, find out what Gene Kirkpatrick is up to, because she was known during her years in New York, she was known as Miss Israel, because she defended every atrocity committed by the State of Israel against Palestinian women and children. Every bullet fired into those civilians in Palestine was paid for by the American taxpayer. You taxpayers pay every Israeli soldier $12,000 a year. So they have a free hand to do whatever they want to maintain their occupation of the West Bank, to deny the Palestinian people their autonomy, and to give them the nation which they strive for, and a position in the world which they strive for. Now, I had a friend on the House Banking and Currency Committee named Congressman Wright Patman. He spent most of his congressional career trying to find out two things. He wanted to find out who actually owned the stock of the Federal Reserve banks, and he wanted to conduct an audit of the Federal Reserve System. He died without ever attaining either of those objectives. But after I was able to obtain the original organizational charts of the 12 Federal Reserve banks in 1983, I was able, from those charts, to find out the principal stockholders of the major stockholders of the Federal Reserve banks for the first time. Now there are a number of congressmen battling to audit the Federal Reserve System, to bring them up to date, to find out what they've been doing. You also have Congressman Hamilton, who is trying to lift the veil of secrecy from the Federal Reserve Board meetings. They have what they call the Federal Open Market Committee, which has absolute control over the daily price of money and the daily quantity of money throughout the United States. This means they can dictate whether the stock market shall go up or the stock market shall go down. Now, to have that information ahead of time is worth millions of dollars to anybody. So this is why they say they must operate in absolute secrecy. But these same governors of the Federal Reserve System are appointed by these banks, and you can be pretty certain that the chief stockholders of those banks have some idea of which way things are going to go. They have some way of making their wishes known to the Board of Governors. When Paul Volcker was named chairman of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors by President Jimmy Carter, the New York Times stated that Volcker had been actually chosen by David Rockefeller and by Robert Russo. David Rockefeller was president of the Chase Manhattan Bank in New York, and Robert Russo was a partner of Brown Brothers Harriman. So you see, you have a very small crew running the affairs of the United States. And then, of course, when you had Alan Greenspan chosen as the next chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, Alan Greenspan came to the Federal Reserve from J.P. Morgan Company. Now, I mentioned to you in November 1910, one of the Jekyll Island conspirators was Henry A. Davison, the right-hand man of J.P. Morgan at J.P. Morgan Company. Now here, 75 years later, you had a partner of J.P. Morgan Company chosen as the new chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. And of course, Paul Volcker had come to Washington as the chairman of the Board of Governors from the position of president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and he had originally worked for the Rockefeller Bank, Chase Manhattan Bank, and he had a long history of serving the big money interests in New York. And of course, after Paul Volcker became chairman of the board, we had the most ruinous inflation that we've had in many years. We had 25%. You may remember those tough years when many automobile dealers, home builders, contractors were forced out of business because the interest rate had skyrocketed to a point that they could not sell a car, they could not sell a house. This is the power which the Federal Reserve Board of Governors has over every citizen of the United States. As I say, I went to see George Hansen in 1983, and he was on the Federal Reserve Board. He was on the Federal Reserve Subcommittee of the House Banking and Currency Committee. I talked to him and I talked to Ron Paul, who was also on that committee. They were both subsequently defeated in their re-election bids for Congress. George Hansen was not only defeated for Congress by the active intervention of IRS agents in his home state of Idaho. They went to every contributor in his campaign, and they threatened them with audits, and they put pressure on them, and George Hansen wound up being defeated. They also put him in prison because they had passed an ethics bill in Congress which set up certain bookkeeping regulations which a congressman were supposed to follow. It was so complicated, no congressman knew how to do it. George Hansen sought help from other congressmen and from lawyers, and he filled it out to the best of his ability. Later on, they singled out George Hansen, no other congressman, and said that he had not filled it out correctly, therefore he was in violation. He was sent to prison, he was paroled, and I was on the podium with George Hansen a number of times. We spoke in Dallas, and at that meeting, the agents were there to pick him up and return him for violation of parole. But he and I went out to lunch out a side door, and they missed us. So the next day, they arrested him while he was speaking at a religious meeting at Omaha, Nebraska. They flew him to Washington. They put him in prison under an assumed name so that no one knew where he was. He had his hands manacled behind his back at all times, and George was a heavy-set man, about 260 pounds. Then they took him down to Petersburg Federal Prison in Virginia to serve out the rest of his sentence. The treatment meted out to him was so brutal that 268 congressmen signed a petition to the President of the United States to ameliorate his conditions or even to grant him parole. Hundreds of thousands of letters and telegrams were sent to the White House asking for clemency for George Hansen. That was totally ignored because George Hansen had to be gotten rid of because he told me he was in line to become the next chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee. In that position, he would have had absolute authority over the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. They were determined they were not going to let George Hansen be reelected. They were going to get him out of Congress. They did get him out of Congress. He's out of Congress today. He served every day of his sentence without parole, as though he had been the most hardened criminal in the United States. This was a man who had never offended anybody, had never gotten even a parking ticket. And the Washington Post even commented wryly on the editorial page. They said, the Department of Justice would have you believe that the streets of Washington are safer today because George Hansen is in prison. But this is what happens when you offend the secret powers of the world order, control our government. Ron Paul ran for president of the United States on the Libertarian Party. I had advised both George Hansen and Ron to run for president as Republicans. They were Republicans. They had been in Congress as Republicans. I said, run as Republicans. Go into your party. But no, they decided to be independents, which meant they had to raise money. They got no media attention whatsoever. And of course, I doubt if any of you saw Ron Paul's many speeches during the 1984 campaign. He was only allowed to appear on CNN and various cable networks. He never got any major news coverage. And another acquaintance of mine, David Duke of Louisiana, ran for president on the Populist Party ticket. He also got absolutely no media attention. And in fact, when they had a meeting of presidential candidates, a debate between presidential candidates at Tulane University in Louisiana, I was down there at that time, they refused to allow David Duke to participate in that meeting because he would have gotten media attention. He was absolutely frozen out. They would not let him into the building. So then, after the presidential campaign, David Duke decided to run for an opening in the state legislature. And the people of his district, a working class district in Louisiana, Metairie, Louisiana, they worked very hard. They house-to-house canvassed, and they let the people know that David Duke wanted to represent them. And they elected him overwhelmingly, despite the fact that the entire upper echelon of the Republican Party came down and campaigned against him for his opponent. And it backfired on them because it was so flagrant what they were doing, so blatant, that the people said, we're not going to be dictated to by Washington. We are going to elect our own state representative, and they did exactly that. After he was elected, Lee Atwater, the Republican National Committee leader, wanted to have the legislature refuse to seat David Duke, who had been legally elected. Other leading Republicans, including George Bush himself, tried to stop David Duke from being seated in the legislature. They couldn't do it. They were defeated. They walked away with egg on their faces, and David Duke is sitting in the Louisiana legislature today, where he is almost the only member who is battling against higher taxes, battling against a greater extension of the bureaucracy. And this is what we need all over the United States. We need for local people to elect their own representatives. We need to defeat the well-paid minions of the world order who intend to bind more chains upon us. And we have to defend ourselves on every level. This is the problem. This is what the Constitution wanted us to do. They set up the safeguards. It is up to us to live by those safeguards and to defend our nation and our Constitution. Thank you.